All right, well, let's get started. So, Joan, thanks for being with us today. I want to introduce Joan Ilacqua.
Yep, Ilacqua.
Got it. Thank you. Thank you. Sorry about that. In celebration of LGBTQ History Month, we welcome Joan of the History Project to give us insight into history and the usage of language, labels, and pronouns today. So thank you for joining us. Hopefully you can tell us a little bit about yourself and how you became part of the History Project. And thanks again.
Yeah, no, my pleasure. Thank you for inviting me. And here, I will share my screen. And so folks have something to look at while I chat. And I will pull up my notes on my other screen, hopefully. We were talking about how we've all been on Zoom. It's been Zoom for 2 years and I still do Zoom wrong. But yeah, so today I'm going to talk a bit about the language and history of that language in the LGBTQ plus initialism. And so I am the executive director of the History Project, and we are a community archives here in Boston, Massachusetts. We have been around since 1980, and our mission is to document, preserve, and share LGBTQ plus history. And so in our collections, we have archival collections. We have over 250 of them at this point. We document the experiences of the community. Our oldest records date to the 1940s. Our newest records are being created right now and brought into the archives. And so, you know, our collections range from organizational records, personal papers, publications, t-shirts, buttons, flyers, all of that material that documents the life of LGBTQ people in Massachusetts and New England. Personally, I am, in addition to being executive director, a public historian and archivist. And so what that means is that it's my job to highlight stories that have been hidden or ignored throughout history. It's really my privilege to be able to do this work. And I really love being able to share stories of our community that you might not have learned about in high school. So because I am a historian, I have an outline of what we'll be talking about today in the presentation, along with, on the left, a picture of an early flyer from the History Project. We really got our start as an organization run by volunteer archivists, activists, and historians who reached out to each other to learn more about how people had been talked about throughout history. And I'll tell you a bit too about how archivists continue to do this work today. So in terms of language, when we are talking about LGBTQ, that is an initialism, and it stands for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer. All of these words are relatively recent in the grand scheme of things, but we'll get into the history of them, when we started to use them, and what they refer to. And I invite folks who are here, please feel free to put questions in the chat if you'd like. We'll have time for Q&A at the end, definitely. But if you have, a burning question, please feel free to ask it. So what you're looking at here is a tool called the Gender Unicorn. And this was developed by a group called Trans Student Educational Resources. And what this worksheet helps you do is think about the different intersecting identities, orientations, expressions that we all have. So the terms lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer relate to gender identity, gender expression, and attraction. And so going through this tool is a really kind of easy way to get yourself into the mindset of what are we talking about when somebody says queer community or LGBTQ community. So the first is gender identity, which is your internal sense of gender, of being male or female, of being neither or both, or another gender even. Everyone has a gender identity. And that identity is not necessarily the same as your gender expression, the way that you express yourself and show yourself to the world, or the sex assigned to you at birth by a doctor. And so using me as an example, my gender identity is female. I am a woman. I was born a woman, so my gender identity matches my sex assigned at birth. Gender expression or presentation is how you show gender. And you do that through your clothing, your hairstyle, maybe the way that you talk, other ways that you present yourself in the world. Gender identity and expression usually line up in some way. A person might identify as male and present themselves to the world wearing masculine clothing. A person like me might identify as female. You can't tell. I'm wearing a cardigan, which is a very archivist outfit. I tend to dress pretty femininely, and that's how I show myself in the world. And that's what your gender expression is. And so terms for gender expression could be feminine, they could be masculine, they could be androgynous. It's really your gender expression doesn't have to relate to what your gender is, but it can. Sex assigned at birth, like I mentioned, is a classification, and that's based on your anatomy, your hormones, and your chromosomes. So when we are born, a doctor assigns your sex to you by, I'm not a doctor, I won't get into how they do it, but you might be assigned as male, female, intersex, a combination of male and female, or neither or both. And what somebody is assigned at birth doesn't have to match their gender identity or expression. And generally, someone who identifies in a way that doesn't relate to their sex assigned at birth is part of the trans community. And so those are really the three kind of categories of gender. The way that you define yourself, the way that you express yourself, and then kind of medically, how were you assigned when you were born? Whereas physical and emotional attraction is how you define sexuality, essentially. So to be physically attracted to someone of the opposite sex or of a different sex is to be heterosexual. To be attracted to someone who is of the same sex is to be homosexual. And words like lesbian, gay, bisexual, queer all relate to that attraction. And so if you were to fill out the gender unicorn, it's different for everyone. But it's one way of sort of thinking through, how do I move through the world? How and kind of expanding your mind to think about how others may also move through the world. So we're going to talk about pronouns. Pronouns, everyone's got them, and they are the words we use to talk about a person when we're not using their name. For example, my pronouns are she and her. Other people might use he and him, they or them. There are also neo pronouns like z and zir. Those honestly are a little bit of a 90s phenomenon. They're making a comeback right now, but it's your pronouns are personal to you. Some people might use one set of pronouns. I use she and hers, which is one set. Some people might use a combination like she and they, she, he, or they, any pronouns. People change their pronouns at different points in their life. Some people use the same set their whole life. It's really a sort of personal decision, but also, the important thing to remember about pronouns is making sure that we use the pronouns that someone themselves would use. It's an important way of respecting another person to use the pronouns that they share with you. and to do your best to be welcoming and respectful to those that you're interacting with. English pronouns are gendered, so often the pronouns we use refer to gender, but you can't tell someone's gender just by looking at them. So you can't assume. And when you can assume, how do you deal with pronouns? How do you interact with people, like I said, respectfully and in a welcoming way? And the very short guide to pronouns is just don't assume somebody else's gender. If you don't know it, try using something like they. That's generally what I do if I don't know someone's pronouns. I just say, they said this, that person over there. And the easiest way to learn is to ask. You can exchange pronouns with another person by saying, hi, I'm Joan, I use she, her pronouns. And what about you? You can do the soft ask, again, similarly, like when you introduce another person, hi, this is Mike. Mike, what pronouns do you use? And this seems awkward at first. It becomes very easy with practice. It has become a lot more common for people to do in group settings and introductions. And you will eventually get it. It'll eventually become totally normative. And the reason why we go to this sort of length with pronouns is, again, to ensure that we are being respectful, we are being affirming, we are validating somebody else's experience. And, sometimes we're wrong when we do that. And everyone's wrong sometimes. I professionally work in LGBTQ spaces and I even get it wrong sometimes. So, don't get upset with yourself. Don't make a big deal out of it. Apologize briefly and then move on and try to do better the next time. I will say, if you have trouble, especially with using they instead of he or she, maybe you had a teacher who told you that that was not grammatically correct, you kind of have to train yourself to start doing it. You can practice by, a friend of mine actually suggested getting a plant and using they, them pronouns with your plant. That's my cactus over there. They really love the sun, and that sort of thing, which again feels a little silly, but is a way of practicing, of making this normal, of making this part of your routine, and a way in which you can just be respectful of other people. And if you hear somebody else use the wrong pronouns for someone, say you're in conversation and like the Mike I gave you, for example, that's Mike over there. He does this or that. And somebody would jump in and say, Mike uses them. And that would be it. And it's really easy to also, continue to create a, culture of acceptance and affirmation and being welcome. I'm happy to talk more about pronouns or to answer specific questions about pronouns, but this is just a really quick guide. My advice is do your best, practice, apologize if you need to, and, don't worry about getting it wrong so long as you're trying. So we're going to move into some history now. And the history of that LGBTQ initialism that I talked about. So at the beginning, L and G, lesbian and gay. And those words have a very long history. Lesbian, which refers to women who are attracted to other women, came into popular usage in the mid-20th century. It refers to the island of Lesbos, which is where the famous lesbian poet Sappho is from. And the earliest we start to see it is in the 1870s. It is used in medical literature to describe women attracted to other women. In 1955, Del Martin, Phyllis Lyons, and others began to meet and socialize and became a group called the Daughters of Bilitis. And they are considered the first lesbian social organization in the United States. Del and Phyllis are in that image in the middle there. They came to Boston for a meeting with other women in the Daughters of Bilitis chapter here. And when the group first got together, they actually didn't use the word lesbian. They called themselves variant women because lesbian had a negative medical connotation. Throughout the 60s and 70s, though, the term was reclaimed and began to be used in a mainstream way. Gay, on the other hand, dates back to the 12th century in English. It comes from the Old French gay, meaning joyful, happy, carefree. But to call someone gay also held some immoral connotations. You know, carefree could mean uninhibited. Gay was used a lot of times to describe theaters, sex workers, you know, unattached and carefree bachelors or bachelorettes in the 19th and 20th century in particular. In more modern times, we see gay used in a book by Gertrude Stein. In 1922, she describes a homosexual relationship as gay. We also see it in the 1938 Bringing Up Baby movie, where Cary Grant is cross-dressing and called gay. There's this shift that happens again in the mid-20th century where gay starts to mean hedonistic, uninhibited, and straight is used to describe people who are respectful, serious, straight-laced. Gay could also mean campy, effeminate, and it was used by what is now the gay community. After World War II, homosexual was also in use. Similar to lesbian, it had a medical connotation. And so some of the early activists created organizations that they called homophile organizations. Homophile means loving the same. The Daughters of Bilitis and the Mattachine Society, which was founded in 1950 by Harry Hay, were both homophile organizations. Mattachine was specifically for gay men. And they were interested in unifying gay people, you know, creating education about gay people, assisting those who were oppressed. And like I said, over time, the community took the word and began to use it. As we get into the gay liberation movement in the early days of the movement, especially after the Stonewall riots in 1969, we see people talking about lesbian women and gay men. But the initialism is longer than that now. And we start to see other terms being added to it over time. The next that gets added is bisexual. And the term bisexual also dates back to the late 1800s. It was used in English by an American neurologist. And prior to its use to talk about sexuality, it typically was used to refer to reproductive systems of plants. Bisexual Americans really gained visibility through the research of Alfred Kinsey and his colleagues in the late 1940s and 1950s. And bisexual as a definition means attracted to more than one sex, to men and women. Today, people might use the term pansexual as it is more broad than two. It can mean more than one gender. I've also heard bi plus to mean, you know, more than one gender, but also affirming that there are more than two genders. Some of the earliest organizations for bisexuals started in the 1960s. The first was the Sexual Freedom League in San Francisco. And that was facilitated by Margot Rila and Frank Exposito. Bisexual people were integral to the modern pride movement. After the Stonewall riots in 1969, yearly commemorations began to take place. Those commemorations are now considered pride marches or pride celebrations. They happen every June. And bisexual activist Brenda Howard, who's pictured in the bottom left photo, and she is all the way on the left, she became known as the Mother of Pride for her work in coordinating the first Pride March in New York City. Visibility for bisexual people greatly increased after the second National March on Washington, which took place on October 11th, 1987. The button for the march is in the top left. You'll see that bisexual people are not named on the button, but it was the first time a contingent of bisexual people marched. They held a national bisexual gathering, and that led to the founding of the North American Bisexual Network. That march in Washington is also important right now in October, because that's where National Coming Out Day comes from. In commemoration of that march, beginning in 1988, on October 11th, people around the world celebrated people around America, celebrated National Coming Out Day, a day to come out, assert yourself, and share who you are with the world. And in honor of all of that, that is why October is LGBTQ plus History Month now. So lesbian, gay, and bisexual all relate to sexual attraction, romantic attraction, whereas transgender relates to gender. A lot of the images on this slide are from the Digital Transgender Archives, which is a really amazing resource and tool. And then a couple of images are from the History Project collections here in Boston of different marches and protests here. So historically, to describe the trans community, there are a lot of words that we no longer use that are considered pejorative, that I'm not going to share now because I don't want you to use any of them by accident. But transgender as a word was coined in 1965 by a Columbia University psychiatrist. And he was specifically refuting one of these earlier terms. He argued that transgender was more appropriate because it describes gender identity rather than sexual orientation. And by the mid-1970s, we start to see the terms transgender and trans used as an umbrella term. We also see many of these other terms I mentioned that are now pejorative being used throughout the 1970s. And it's really not until the 1990s that transgender becomes a mainstream term. Particularly activists and theorists like Susan Stryker start to use transgender to define, quote, all identities or practices that cross over, cut across, move between, or otherwise queer, socially constructed sex and gender boundaries. And so trans is the term of use today to describe somebody whose gender identity or expression doesn't match with a sex assigned at birth. And that is used sort of in opposition or in comparison to cisgender, another term that comes up in the 1990s to describe somebody whose gender identity or expression matches with their sex assigned at birth. And then we have the Q at the end of LGBTQ. Q stands for queer. Queer is a term that some people still consider to be pejorative. It was a slur that was really taken back and owned as a result of the AIDS epidemic, and activists like ACT UP, Queer Nation, the Lesbian Avengers, and others who took that slur and made it their own. And queer can be an umbrella term for somebody who's part of the LGBTQ community. It can be the word that someone uses to describe themselves if they feel that one of the other words is too limiting of their experience. LGBTQ is an initialism one, gets longer over time, but two, every term or identity that is part of the queer community is not explicitly listed out there. And so I wanted to include here some other examples. I mentioned earlier pansexual, somebody who is attracted to more than one gender or all genders. Genderqueer, somebody who might be both masculine and feminine, or both, or neither. Asexual, somebody who has no romantic or sexual attraction to other people. Non-binary, somebody who feels that their gender doesn't fit within the binary of male and female. There are a lot of labels now. But the important thing to remember and think about here is just that as long as you're being respectful of somebody else's experience and expression, and willing to learn more, where I'm constantly learning more, you, I think, have a pretty good handle on the language and labels of the community. And I will mention on this slide, I have a picture on the right of Gia Sockmata Neptune, who is a transgender member of the Passamaquoddy tribe in Maine. They identify as two-spirit, which is a specifically Native American or indigenous term. It describes someone who is could be more than one gender or is transgender. It's a term that actually dates to 1990 when trans Native Americans coined it and began using it at a conference. Not all trans indigenous people are two-spirit, but some are, and I just want you to be aware of them. Gio's a really amazing, actually, basket weaver and activist in Maine, and you can learn more about their work online. So, with all of this information, as historians, how do we find LGBTQ people throughout history? The language has changed, the language is constantly changing. And because of that, we as historians look for certain terms or signifiers that were used in the past, words that we might not use now, but were popular in the past. And the issue with that, though, is that sometimes we find sources where people have the privilege to write about themselves, to collect and save written records about their experience, or we have records about people who were arrested or tried, people who were wrote about in newspapers or in court records, or even in medical records. And so I wanted to share some of the examples of people we know about through history, and then we'll have time for questions right at the end. So many literary figures and artists we would now consider part of our LGBTQ community. We know about their experience because all of these people in this slide were pretty privileged, they were affluent, they could be eccentric, without too much fear of retaliation for going against societal norms. And so starting from the top left, we have Ralph Waldo Emerson, influential thinker, poet, transcendentalist. He kept a journal throughout his life, and while he was a student at Harvard, he developed a crush on a young scholar named Martin Gay. And Martin was someone who Emerson was totally obsessed with. He waxed poetically about Martin. He drew sketches of Martin. And later in his life, he edited his own journals. He removed portions of them, but not all of them. And we know that he was very interested in Martin and wrote about him for at least 2 years. And so with this example in particular, you know, I don't feel comfortable saying that Emerson was gay. That's a term that we use now. It's a modern term, but what's going on here is something that goes against societal norms. And I think it's appropriate to include him as part of the historic LGBTQ community. Other literary figures who I'd put into this category include Henry David Thoreau, likely best known for Walden. He expressed his romantic interest and feelings throughout his life in his poetry and in his personal writings. We have a poem from 1839 called Lately Alas, I Knew a Gentle Boy, which he wrote about one of his summer boyfriends. And I'm just going to quote the poem to you. It's actually very lovely. So was I taken unawares by this? I quite forgot my homage to Congress. Yet now I'm forced to know, though hard it is, I might have loved him had I loved him less. And so there are other examples in Thoreau's writing, but similar to Emerson, Thoreau had the privilege and opportunity to write about himself and to not really fear that writing would be used against him in his lifetime. Emily Dickinson from Western Massachusetts was pretty intense about her romantic feelings for several women throughout her life. This includes her sister-in-law, Susan Gilbert. Later, Gilbert's childhood friend, Kate Scott, was somebody who Emily Dickinson was very interested in. Similarly to Thoreau, there's a poem that Emily wrote in 1860 after spending a night with Kate. And the poem reads, "Her sweet weight on my heart a night had scarcely deigned to lie, when stirring for belief's delight, my bride had slipped away." There are other examples in Emily Dickinson's poetry that show her interest in other women, her romantic feelings toward other women, although her family did heavily edit her poetry after her death in 1886. So there's fewer examples, but they are still there. The two other photos on this slide, on the left is Edmonia Lewis. On the right is Charlotte Cushman, who's standing, along with Emma Stebbins, who is sitting. Edmonia Lewis was a sculptor. She was of Black and Ojibwa heritage. She attended Oberlin College, where she faced extreme prejudice. She eventually dropped out and came to Boston, where she trained as a sculptor, particularly in marble portrait busts. After she gained some infamy in 1865, she created a bust of Robert Gould Shaw, who was in the 54th, or led the 54th Regiment that came out of Boston. She got enough money that she left Boston and went to Rome. And in Rome, she joined an active community of American and British artists who were living abroad. And she was welcomed into that community by Charlotte Cushman. Cushman was an actress, also from Boston, and on stage, she appeared as a man. She wore men's clothing. One of her early plays, she played Romeo against her sisters Juliet. And in Rome, she oversaw this feminist international colony in the 1850s and 60s. In her homes in Boston, Newport, and Rome, other independent women lived and worked. Several sculptors were part of her Rome contingent. And those sculptors included several women that she had relationships with. Emma Stebbins, who's in that photo, artist Harriet Hosmer, and others. We know about Cushman's romantic entanglements because she wrote about them. She dated several women. She was kind of, I think maybe we'd call her a cad. She got with one girl and then she'd cheat on her and get with somebody else. And then it was messy. Edmonia joined them in Rome, and it's not clear what Edmonia's romantic entanglements were. She never had a male partner. She never married. She spent a lot of time hanging out with women who I would now probably call lesbians. And I think it's important to talk about her story in particular because of the prejudice she faced, because of the challenges of being a sculptor of color during this time period. She became internationally recognized for her work. And then for about 100 years, she was not in the spotlight. She died in 1907. Her work was forgotten over time, and she's really been rediscovered. Her work is now in the Smithsonian. It adorns several graves in Mount Auburn Cemetery here in Boston, or it's in Cambridge, but close. And she just had a US Postal Service stamp created in her honor this past year. Some other terms that we look for, at least in the late 1800s, include Boston marriage or confirmed bachelor. The image on the left is of Annie Fields and Sarah Orne Jewett in the library and the home that they shared on Beacon Hill in Boston. Annie Fields was a widow. Her husband, James, had died. He had been an editor and publisher. And after his death, she and Sarah Orne Jewett became lifelong companions. They lived, worked, and traveled with each other for over 20 years. They wrote really romantic letters to each other. They journaled about one another, and they were together until their deaths in the early 20th century. The term Boston marriage is a partnership between two women who had the means to support one another. They could be two college graduates. They could be two, wealthy women who lived with each other. From the outside, they might look like deep friendships, and some of them may have been, but others, like Sarah Orne Jewett and Annie Fields, based on the evidence we have, were definitely relationships. The term dates to 1886 from the novel The Bostonians by Henry James, which he described a Boston marriage. His sister Alice and her partner Catherine were his inspiration for the book. Confirmed bachelor is ambiguous, it's euphemistic, it's a way of describing a gay man. A confirmed bachelor is unmarried, uninterested in marriage, uninhibited in his socializing. British newspapers used a similar phrase, quote, "he never married," in obituaries to imply homosexuality. In the two images in the bottom right, we have some examples of some confirmed bachelors. One was A. Pyatt Andrew. He was an economist. He was the director of the American Ambulance Field Service during World War I. He was a member of the U.S. House of Representatives from Massachusetts. He had a home in Gloucester, and that home, which was called Red Roof, he kept guest books. And those guest books show his social life, that he was constantly having parties, and we have a really strong record of who was showing up to these parties. Those people included his neighbor Henry Sleeper, who is known as America's first interior decorator, artists, people like Isabella Stewart Gardner, who has a museum here in Boston, and among others. And it's one way that we can sort of track and see, based on who was hanging out with A. Pyatt Andrew, what community he was part of. Some of the guests who came to his house kept extensive journals and records about their own entanglements, and that's another way we can learn more about historic gay people. The picture on the right is of Charlie Gibson. He founded the Gibson House Museum in Boston. He never married. He consorted with other confirmed bachelors. He participated in a bohemian subculture, which was another euphemistic way of saying gay. He never had a long-term partner, although he stayed in contact with the Count de Monet, Maurice Talvand, who he had a romantic relationship with when he was in his 20s. And the Gibson House Museum talks about Charlie's experience as being a gay or queer person in the late 19th and early 20th century. And then the last term I wanted to just mention is masquerading and passing. This is sort of a fun story about a person whose name was Ethel Kimball. Ethel was a person who dressed as a man most of the time. They were assigned female at birth, and they were infamous. Their exploits are well documented in newspapers between the 1910s and 1920s. In particular, One time, Ethel was arrested here on State Street in Boston on charges of stealing an automobile. Police pulled over John Hathaway and soon found out that John was in fact Ethel. Ethel had spent the last 2 years pretending to be a wealthy widower, saying that they were a graduate of MIT. And during that time, they even got married. They married a girl named Louise Eichler from Somerville. And before Ethel was arraigned in court, police brought Ethel women's clothes. Ethel refused to change and said, I wore men's clothing because I wanted to approach life's problems from a man's viewpoint, especially the problem of unemployment. Ethel has a long track record of arrests. The earliest that I found is 1911, where Ethel claims to be Thomas Scollins, and Ethel gets caught trying to buy a car using a fake check. Later on in 1924, Ethel gets married again to Pearl Davis of Parsonsfield, Maine. Although Davis's nephew feels that something, fishy was going on there and turned Ethel into authorities who found out that Ethel was a woman. Despite serving time in jail, in hospitals, and being arrested over and over again, Ethel continued to live and dress as a man. And so although Ethel is not likely to have thought of themselves as transgender, if only for the fact that the term didn't exist in the early 20th century, their struggles and efforts to live as a man imply that Ethel understood themselves as a man and acted accordingly. So, like I said, Ethel, you see these newspaper articles that are talk about Ethel being caught. I use the name Ethel because it's the name they used throughout their life. They had a lot of aliases. They didn't stick with one over time. The last we hear of them is in 1930, I believe. They moved from Boston to New York, and they get arrested in New York, and New York police write back to Boston police asking for information, and Boston police essentially say, good luck with that. And then Ethel is lost to history. So at the History Project, we collect and preserve the history of the LGBTQ community because LGBTQ history is a relatively new phenomenon. The behaviors that we're talking about, the terms associated with LGBTQ, have really come into use over the past 50 to 70 years. And before that time, people either didn't have the words to define themselves or were defined by the legality of the actions that they were doing. They were subject to arrest. They were subject to rejection by their families, termination by their employers. And we continue to document and preserve LGBTQ history to help community members and allies gain a deeper, richer understanding of the lives of LGBTQ people, and to connect current activists, current young people, back to the movement, back to our LGBTQ ancestors, to show that we are part of a community that has very deep roots in America, and that, all history is also LGBTQ history. And so that's where I'm going to end us today. I want to say, first of all, thank you so much for having me here. I am more than happy to answer any questions that you have. I also wanted to share, I know we're recording, you can email me at info@historyproject.org if you have a question later, or if you have a question you don't want to ask. I'm happy to connect you with educational resources, because there is a lot out there. And yeah, I'm just really pleased to have been here today. So thank you for having me. I'm going to stop the share.
Joan, thank you.
My pleasure.
Thank you. I think I would have liked to talk to Ethel. She might have been interesting to maybe have a beer with and get to know her better. She was very adventurous, wasn't she?
Yeah, so Ethel, I ended up writing part of my graduate thesis on Ethel because Ethel is fascinating. Like Ethel is somebody who, the kids say now, be gay, do crime, which is like a meme that young people do. That was Ethel's life. Ethel was just, living life the way that they wanted to, sometimes dressed as a woman, sometimes dressed as a man, mostly committing crimes. I think that Ethel was really successful at passing as a man, but was very interested also in trying to, what's the term? Get one over.
Quite fearless.
Yeah, exactly.
And those are only the things that we know about her. So
Exactly.
interesting.
I would love to hear about the two wives are the two that I find fascinating. But we don't know what they thought. We don't know, you know, we don't know if they knew. I think that they knew, but
Mhm.
who knows?
Well, thank you. If anybody has any questions, feel free to put it in the Q&A. I have some questions, Jen. I'm curious. I read a little bit about the History Project. Maybe you can tell me a little bit about your background and kind of what led you to being the first executive director.
Yeah. So I am. Oh, there's a question about books. I'll tell you more about books in a second.
Sure.
But yeah, so I was a history major in school. I was really interested in, honestly, I was really interested in, protest and activist kind of history to begin with. And at some point I decided I wanted to work in archives. I ended up working for the National Park Service for several years, learning how to be an oral historian. I ended up back here in Boston for graduate school. I had to do an internship, so I found an organization that needed an intern because at the time I couldn't get paid and I was feeling kind of salty about that. So I said, I'm going to find an organization that's small and needs help. I found the History Project and I really fell in love with doing queer history. I had been I didn't come out until I was in grad school back here in Boston. But being part of a community of other people interested in this history and interested in these stories is what kept me around. And becoming the first executive director, like I said, I was an intern and then I was a volunteer and then I joined the board. And then when the opportunity presented itself, they hired me as executive director. So, yeah.
It's funny how, your journey, where it takes you, having to get that internship, and here you are today.
Exactly. But I'm glad that I found the History Project. It turned out to be a very important organization in my life. So Natalie, and I apologize if I mispronounced your name. What books do I recommend to read that talks about this awesome history? If you're interested in Boston, we have one called Improper Bostonians, and actually I can pull up some links that I can share. So we have, Improper Bostonians is a book that the History Project put out in about 1998, I believe, that talks about queer history up through the Stonewall riots in 1969. If you want something a little bit more general, there's a link to Improper Bostonians. A Queer History of the United States by Michael Bronski, and here I'll pull a link up to that, is another really good one that gets into the 400 plus year history of LGBTQ people in America. Michael Bronski is a professor at Harvard. He has another version of that book that is for young people that is actually a really wonderful resource. And one of the ones that actually was really popular recently is a book called When Brooklyn Was Queer by Hugh Ryan, which gets into, again, kind of the hidden history of queer people before the gay liberation movement. So those are some that I would recommend. But there are so many now that really, if there's a particular topic or region you're interested in, I can point you in that direction. There are also, so the History Project is a community archives, which means that we exist because of and for the LGBTQ community here in Massachusetts. There are community archives, LGBTQ community archives across the country. So actually, I'm pretty good friends with the people who run the Southern Invisible Histories Project they're in like 4 states. They're in Alabama and Georgia and Florida and another state, Louisiana maybe. And there's GLBT in San Francisco. There's Lesbian Herstory in New York. There's Gerber Hart in Chicago. I have a friend somewhere in Ohio who's trying to start something, but I'm sure that there are collections there as well. A lot of the history we talk about is local. And so, if you're interested, try a quick Google and see what pops up, because people are documenting their experiences all over the country.
Do you ever collaborate, share archives with these other cities?
Yeah, so sometimes we do events together. That's sort of the easiest way to collaborate. For instance, there's actually an LGBTQ community archives in Lexington, Kentucky. They're called the Faulkner Morgan Archives. And we did an event together last year where a woman who was from Kentucky but spent a lot of her life up in Boston, we did an oral history with her. And she is a poet and a musician. And so she talked about kind of the experience of living in these 2 places, the differences and similarities of being, an LGBTQ person in both Kentucky and Massachusetts. And so we do things like that. We also, we share publications during LGBTQ History Month. We're sharing each other's resources on social media a lot. Because it's like I said, it tends to be a local history that we're talking about. And so it's kind of exciting to be able to show, this is what's happening in Boston, but what about New Orleans? What about Minneapolis?
Anything exciting coming in 2023? Any projects on your plate you're looking forward to?
Yeah, so we, before that, we have a couple of events coming up. We do a lot of virtual events. So actually we have a book club. We're reading the book Carmilla, which is a vampire. It's a lesbian vampire novella. It predates Dracula. And so we're getting together to talk about that over Zoom in 2 weeks. In 2023, we just hired a new director of archives and outreach. So we have a lot of archives projects that'll be going on, some digitization, some reorganizing, which, as I'm saying this, sounds really exciting to archivists and maybe not that exciting to everyone else, but it means that we're making collections available, putting them online, making them accessible to anyone who's interested around the country. And then we have more events happening in November and a ton for next year that I can't announce yet because I don't have any links to them. But I would say, check us out at historyproject.org. And you can check out actually our YouTube channel for a whole archive of all the events we've done since COVID started.
Interesting. Thank you. Any other questions from our attendees? I'm fascinated with the oral history. Are you doing a lot of collections, a lot of collecting of that information?
Yeah, oral histories are really fun. And also are a way to document and share the history of people who haven't had, the opportunity to hang on to their own records. Especially here in Boston, we find people who are or who were here when they were younger, who were activists right out of college or lived here in their 20s and then move on to somewhere else. They ditch their papers when you move, and now everyone is Marie Kondoing, so like that becomes its own kind of issue. But an oral history is great. Somebody can tell their own story in their own words. They can, add to this record that we already have. And it's so important, especially when LGBTQ people, now libraries and archives around the country are amazing, but for a long time, they weren't as forthright about what LGBTQ collections they had. And it's one way of adding to that historical record. of being able to say, I was there and this is what I experienced. Or, here's the, I was going to say StoryCorps does a lot of LGBTQ stories on NPR, which are like so heartwarming and touching. And, usually if StoryCorps comes on in the morning, it means that I'm having a late day and have missed when I'm supposed to get started. But they're just, so fun to listen to.
Well, thank you for being here today. Obviously, you have so much passion and drive for the history, and we appreciate what you do. Hope you'll join us again.
Oh, I would love to. And again, in all sincerity, if anyone has any questions, email me at info@historyproject.org, or I'm sure if they reach out to Kendal can get questions back to me. I'm happy to, I'm an archivist. I'm happy to either answer your question or point you in the right direction or suggest a book or, find LGBTQ history in your area, whatever, helps you. So again, thank you so much for having me here.
Thank you. Have a great weekend.
You too. Goodbye.
Thanks everyone for joining us today.